the American songbook songs can be played within one major scale. And the same with all these licks. One major scale. The major scale contains many of the functions we need when we're playing jazz, and of course many of the chords. I want to start with how to build a chord. Start with a scale, take one scale note. In this example it's the C. I'm building up thirds in the scale, taking every third from the C. C, E, adding the G, adding the B. You do this with all the chord notes, you have all the chords in the scale. Then you give them all a Roman cipher, and then you know which one is which. I want to take a look at this beautiful jazz standard Perdido in C major. And I'm only going to take the first 8 bars. When we compare the chords of Perdido with our major scale, the C major scale, you see the D minor chord, the G7 chord, the C major chord, and the E minor chord. They all fit in the C major scale. Only one of the chords we see in Perdido in the first 8 bars falls outside. It's the A7 chord. We'll get back to that later. How do I find this out? I look at a tune and I look at the chords. I check with all the major scales I know and see where most of them fit. Another great trick to see what scale you're in, look at the chord where the melody ends. This is mostly the major or minor scale of the tune. In this example, Perdido, C major. Knowing this means that you have 4 notes per bar playing a solo. So this should be a great incentive to practice the chords of the tunes and practice the chords of your major scale. There's one thing though, you see in the 3rd bar there's a C major 6 chord. Why is that? Why it's not the C major 7? Because on the melody note, the C, the B and the C clashes. And that's why they choose to put the A in the chord instead of the B. When you play up the C major scale, you end on this, the 7th note, the B, and stop there. You hear, you need to play that C to finish off the scale. The B is the leading tone of the key, leading towards the root, the C. Looking at our chords again, we're finding the B, the leading tone towards the C on the G7 chord. The 3rd of the G7 is a B. Actually, this means that the G7 very much wants to move towards the C chord. G7 is the dominant chord wanting to go to the C. Leading towards the C major chord. What is the C major chord? It's the tonic chord. Tonic chord is a natural stop where the tune ends. It's a home chord. The G7 wants to go home. In this line, you definitely hear the strong leading effect of the G7 really wanting to go to the C major 7 chord. And you also see how the dominant chord resolves to the C major, but then going to the C6. What's the first chord? The D minor chord. The D minor chord is the subdominant chord of our key. The subdominant chord, the D minor chord, holds both tones of the C major chord, the A and the C. So C, E, G, A. You have the C and the A. They're the same on the subdominant, the D minor chord. But it also has tones from the G7 chord, the D and the F. This means that the D minor chord, the subdominant chord, is somewhere in between the tonic chord, which is home, and the dominant chord, which really leads towards the tonic chord. I made a line here where the D minor as a subdominant function is very clear, going back to the C major. In this line, the D minor clearly goes to the G7. The G7 clearly wants to resolve. I don't resolve it this time. In both examples, the D minor is suspending what's coming. In the first example, the D minor is suspending back to the C major. The second example, D minor, is preparing the G7, the dominant chord, to come. One thing all the chords have in common, they all fit in the C major scale. Which also means we can solo over the first 3 bars just using the C major scale. We just heard how important the function is. The subdominant chord going in between, the dominant chord leading towards the tonic chord. So to play the scale over this, you really need to nail those chord tones. Focus on the chord tones because these spells out the function. The scale does not spell out the function because it has all the notes in between. It has all the notes of all the functions in. Use the music theory, know the chords, know your scales, know your function, and start constructing jazz lines. Start by simply making a line with chord tones and rhythm. The next step would be adding the arpeggios and a little bit of scale to fill out the gaps between the chord notes. In the second line, you see that I'm focusing on connecting the lines in between the bars. First C is going to the first B in the second bar. The B going to the B, leading towards the A. Below, I have a line from D going down to the C. The dominant chord is the 5th degree in the scale, and it holds the leading tone. When we're looking at the A7 in the 4th bar, that's also a dominant chord because it's an A7. But in our major scale, you see we have an A minor 7. The A7 is falling outside the scale, and the tone in the A7 that differs is the C sharp. But the C sharp is the leading tone towards the D in the 5th bar, which is a D minor 7. C sharp going to D. Exactly the same situation we had on the G7, the B leading to the C. On the A7, the C sharp leads to the D. We switch out the C in our A minor chord with the C sharp and we're good to go. With this knowledge, you have the chords, you have the scales on the 2-5-1, you can use the chord tones on the A7, and then you can construct great lines on the first 8 bars of Pedido. In these 8 bars, I start by only using chord tones and rhythm. This is a really important step. Get into these chord notes and just play with the rhythm. Further, I only play in the bar of the function. I stay within the 4 beats. You can see I'm anticipating certain leading tones, emphasizing the functions of the chords. When you're secure on the chord notes and the rhythm, add some scale notes. I try really hard to only play scale notes between the chord notes, beginning the line in the bar and ending the line in the bar on a chord note. And what I said earlier, on the A7 I only use chord notes. More on the secondary dominant, check the videos in the link below. If you want these licks and exercises, go to my Patreon. They're all in the lesson transcription in all 12 keys. In this line, I really focus on how to go over the bar line where I want to be in the next bar. Looking at what target notes I want to hit and aim for these. If you want to dig into this, check the etudes I've made on the Patreon in all 12 keys. Get going on all these chords and all these scales. Feel free to check out these 2 videos. Play music, have fun.